Hey, it's Renee from the craft table. Welcome to another week of our summer embroidery stitch along. Can you believe we're in August already? It's week 10 and we are learning how to embroider the buttonhole / blanket stitch. There are only 3 more weeks of embroidery stitches. We have the satin stitch, pistol stitch, and the woven wheel stitch coming up. Our final week, we'll be talking about ways to finish our embroidery panel and incorporating it into either a framed piece of art or maybe considering stitching it into a pillow cushion, maybe even having it as part of a quilt. There are so many different ways in which you can use your finished embroidery panel. And so I'm super excited to see what everyone has done with their stitching this summer. So for now, my dog is barking in the background. So for now, let's talk about the buttonhole stitch, which is also known as the blanket stitch. So you can see on this panel, if you look closely, there's a couple places where I've already stitched the blanket stitch or the buttonhole stitch. Over here on this yellow section, I stitched it as sort of like a border, and I go over that a little bit later. And then over in this blue area, I was just sort of experimenting different places to stitch this particular stitch. But over here on this flower, this orange flower is where I really wanted to demonstrate how to stitch the buttonhole stitch. And as you can see, I've already started stitching. I've stitched more than half of it. And I recorded, so I recorded a video where I went through all the steps, and then I realized the camera was angled in such a way that you couldn't really see it very well. I was having problems seeing it as I was stitching. So ignore my stitches are not perfect where I've already stitched. But part of the reason why the stitches are not uniform is the leaves are not perfectly symmetrical. As you know, on this panel, the shapes are very whimsical, which is why I like it. And in most cases, that lends itself to being very forgiving when you're stitching a particular embroidery stitch. However, for this particular stitch, it kind of has the opposite effect in that it's difficult to get the stitches really uniform just because of the way you do the stitch and the way the shape is. So those are all of my kind of caveats, disclaimers before I go into describing how to embroider this stitch. One other thing I will say, I use the term buttonhole and blanket stitch interchangeably. Quite a few embroidery stitches, there's different ways to stitch the stitch, and there are different names for a particular stitch. So I am going to show you how I personally like to stitch this stitch, and specifically on like flower petals. So I am using Easy 16 in the 5 weight. If you are stitching on the same panel that I'm stitching on and want to know what color I'm using, that is what I'm using here. All right, to begin the stitch, you're going to come up from the back at the base, if you're doing a flower petal, at the base of your flower petal, or where you want your stitch to begin. And you're going to pull the needle and the thread all the way to the front. Now, the first stitch, in my opinion, looks a little bit like a detached chain stitch or a lazy daisy stitch. Not exactly, but it's similar. So it is similar in that you're going to take your needle down close to where you came up, maybe not necessarily exactly where you came up, which is what we do with the detached chain stitch, but whatever distance away you want your stitch length or width to be, you're going to put your needle down at that spot, and you're going to bring it up where you want your stitch to end. And like the chain stitch, you want your thread behind your needle before you pull your needle through. So you can see it resembles a long lazy daisy stitch. The difference is we're not going to end our stitch by going to the back like we would with a lazy daisy stitch. To continue on, you bring your needle down next to where your previous stitch was. And depending on the shape, you know, the base versus the top, you know, your stitches at the, where you go in may be close together, but further apart at the top. I use the circle as sort of my guide on in this particular spot. And these lines, I'm not using them exactly, but it gives me an idea of, you know, how the stitch should go and what direction, how it should flow. So I'm going to put my needle down right there, and I'm going to bring it up right here. Making sure that I have my thread behind my needle. And making sure that I'm forming that loop as I pull my thread, my needle through. When you're finished stitching a certain area, you're going to take your needle to the back. You take your needle over that last loop towards the back. So I'm just going to continue this process from going from petal to petal. So you can see here I'm using the base of the petal and the edge of the circle to guide where my stitch goes down or where my needle goes down. And then I'm using the curve of the petal as a guide as to where to bring my needle up at the top. This geometric shape, this yellow shape on the outside of this leaf, is probably the closest thing to a border this panel has to demonstrate what the buttonhole stitch would look like along an edge. So I'm going to demonstrate that here. And I'm just using this yellow shape as my guide to where I'm going to be stitching. And the first stitch is a little awkward because you've got this little 90-degree angle thing jutting out. I'm really just taking my needle down at the bottom of this yellow strip and bringing it up at the top of the strip. And I'm just going to do that all along here and then pivot there. So this is my last stitch. So I'm taking my needle back to the back, right over that last little loop to secure my stitch. So that's another example of how you can use the blanket stitch, buttonhole stitch to fill in an area. The smaller rust-colored flower is another place that I stitch the buttonhole stitch. And as you can see, the center is blank at the moment. There aren't any stitches in there. Doing a bunch of French knots in the center of this flower, I think would give it a really good look. But we also have a couple of stitches coming up that would also work well there, including the satin stitch, the pistol stitch, and the woven circle. So stay tuned for those stitches. And in the meantime, practice your buttonhole blanket stitch, and I will see you next week. Happy stitching!